historical name which was given in the past to that group of cities that embraced commerce and through which the Europeans blended with the East, traveling from Istanbul to Alexandria and passing through both Izmir and Adana and Beirut. These cities were a cultural melting pot wherein languages, traditions, religions, and different cultures coexisted. Amid all this history, a small, beautiful, and extremely important mountain sits on the eastern coast. This is Mount Lebanon. The appearance and settlement of religious minorities in Mount Lebanon lasted 5 centuries in the era between the 7th and the 12th centuries. Even during the Phoenician era, there were 50 villages and towns, separated sometimes by only hundreds of meters. Among the proof of the uninterrupted social life in Mount Lebanon, scientific archaeological excavations have revealed buildings and agricultural terraces dating back 5,000 years. Within this geopolitical fact, and amid these great historic currents, there was a community which was destined, time and time again, to face its destiny alone. From the rocky castles they rose, and in the plains they spread. They carried their pride and faith through long centuries. They witnessed both victories and defeats and often suffered painful fates. Their history is highlighted by anxiety and characterized by faith. They are advocates of freedom and prayer. The Maronite flame was emblazoned by a monk who lived in the shade and brought light after his death. He was of Aramaic ethnicity, he spoke Syriac, and his name was Maroon. Although he died before 423, the year when Theodoret, bishop of the Diocese of Cyrus, took office on the episcopal seat in Cyrus, his disciples, monks, and hermits waited between a quarter or a third of a century after the demise of their spiritual mentor to gather and organize themselves in a monastery on the Orontes in Syria. This monastery was called by his name, Maroon. The noble goal behind the inception and the development of the first Maronite community remains that of freedom. Indeed, since the beginning, the definition of Maronite always meant the pursuit and the struggle to remain free, sovereign, and keen to preserve their heritage, destiny, and values. Indeed, this was stated by Dr. Shad Malik, who participated in drafting in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations in 1948. Therefore, when the livelihood of this community narrowed after the Arab conquest, and it was deprived of freedom and spiritual and material stability, it could not survive in the fertile northern area of Syria, which was located on the demarcation line of the conflict between the greatest powers back then, Byzantines and Arabs, in addition to the ever-present struggle against the Orthodox Syriacs. Therefore, the Maronite community chose to travel and move in order to survive. They preferred to live with austerity, but with freedom in the rugged Lebanese mountains with their difficult roads, instead of their former prosperity and ease of living in the fertile plains of northern Syria, where they were in constant conflict in a quasi-permanent conflict zone, where they faced the risk of losing their religious, cultural, and political freedom and identity. As a result, the Maronites actually lived through a unique historical test, which at its core was also a biblical test. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. They settled in the mountains and valleys in Absherri, Neitra, and the region of Baskinta. The newcomers quickly mixed with those who through migration had arrived before them and preached to those indigenous people. Eventually, together they formed one nation and one community called the Maronites. After the destruction in Syria in 1938, and during this period, a large part of the Maronites moved to Mount Lebanon. During their migration to the Lebanese mountains, between the 7th and 10th century and until the arrival of the Crusades to the east, at the end of the 11th century, the Maronites went through a hard test of isolation and ossification. With the new political system, or even before its establishment, new flows of Maronite migrants emerged. this time headed towards the Americas, Africa, and later Australia. Countries of Latin America, as well as the United States of America, were the first destinations of the Lebanese migrants in general, and the Maronites in particular. Livelihoods in the Mutasarrifat were getting less with time, and the same went for recruitment in government departments. Thus, migration and adventure were the exit or the open door towards possible better livelihoods and wealth. Historic references point out that Antonius al-Bashalaini from Slima was the first migrant pioneer. He left for the United States of America in 1854. The Lebanese Maronite order was established in 1695 as a result of regenerative monastic work carried out by 4 young Maronite men from Aleppo. The movement of these young monks, the founders, made them aware that they were part of a young community, but a community that had a cause of high stature and independence. They were keen to be loyal to this history, this cause, and this independence. In the middle of the 20th century, the order established the Monastery of the Holy Spirit of Kaslik to educate the growing generations. Then it became a higher education institution in 1961, the Holy Spirit University of Kaslik. Lebanon is the last bastion of freedom for the Christians of the Middle East. It is therefore an exceptional sign of the presence, creativity, openness and depth of faith of these people, a people who hope and remain hopeful for freedom from persecution, being taunted and tortured because of their faith. It is therefore inadmissible to take the history of suffering and persecution lived by these people for granted, and unacceptable to forget their resistance in these mountains and on these shores. The LMO has devoted special attention to the cause of the sanctification of its saints ever since the era of Superior General Father Ignatius Daghir. The LMO considers that the sainthood of its sons and daughters is the best proof of the depth and richness of its spiritual legacy, and that it is the goal of its adherents and a guarantee for the future. Since 1925, the LMO has submitted the causes of canonization for Father Naamtallah Kassab al-Hardini, Father Sharb al-Makhlouf, and Sister Rafa Shabbak al-Reyes. Finally, if we go back to the early authors of Maronite history, to the Franciscan monk, the Maronite Bishop of Cyprus, Gabriel ibn al-Kilai, we can find a stance that summarizes the awareness Maronites had of themselves. Ibn al-Kilai says, "Maronites form a whole nation, a chosen people sent by God to the Man'a mountain and entrusted by Him to maintain the faith and the dignity of Christians in the East. He then called on them to put their differences aside and stand together as one people with the Church. He explained to them that they would only be saved from the humiliation they had suffered in the past 2 centuries if all categories of people, led by the Patriarch, stood in obedience to Rome."